few significant disclaimers before we begin. I think it appropriate only to justify why we're here to talk about the political economy of Jersey Shore. As Carly read, the predominance of my research is on mass incarceration and criminal punishment. And when she originally called me to come and give a lecture at the Economics Club at George Mason here, I said, oh, excellent, I've got all this new research that I'm working on. And she said, no, I don't want to hear about any of that. I think we'll get a huge crowd if you just repeat the rant that you gave at the summer seminar about the Jersey Shore. And she had explained that she had already started advertising the event. And so I do adhere to the fundamental belief that economics is everywhere, and that all forms of social behavior are but a way in which we can wear the sort of economic way of thinking eyeglasses. So far be it for me to turn down a challenge to have a teaching opportunity to communicate some of the basic principles of economics by means of a show that, for the sake of full disclosure, I truly love. I really like the Jersey Shore. I think it's one of the greatest television shows ever made. I myself, much like some of our more prominent figures in the room, was born in the greatest state of the union, New Jersey. And as a young child, enjoyed building sandcastles, flying kites, and eating cotton candy on the Jersey Shore, as well as riding rides and playing games and whatnot. And I myself, with a last name like D'Amico, am Italian-American, and so identify greatly with many of the cast members. It's sort of like looking into a world that could have been had I not moved to Florida. For example, JWoww is the spitting image of my cousin Denise's best friend, Jamie, who grew up next door to us. And so it's kind of creepy to watch the show from that perspective. So, and as well, I've noted the impact as my Jersey Shore name, which came up because there is a Jersey Shore name generator online. If you yourself want your own Jersey Shore name, simply type in Jersey Shore name generator and type in your own. So, in general, I think that there are multiple different economic frameworks or perspectives that we can use to approach this general topic of how we should think about or the sort of themes that we should recognize in the show. The first, in the tradition of Bastiat, economics truly is everywhere, and humor is a great way to communicate many of its insights. Bastiat was one of the great communicators of economics. I tell my students he was one of, basically the Jon Stewart of his day, with essays like The Petition of the Candlemakers, where he advocates for blocking out the sun in order to subsidize the candle making industry. You recognize the basic notion of trade-offs and opportunity costs. And so the first part of the lecture will be predominantly just communicating the notion that even these ridiculous caricatures of human behavior conform to the basic principles of maximizing benefit, minimizing costs, rational decision-making, and the economic way of thinking, and in a variety of ways, as we'll come to see. The second framework that I think is most interesting about the Jersey Shore, and arguably reality television show in general, is inspired by what I would call the GMU way of thinking. In particular, the research of scholars like Pete Becky, Pete Leeson, Chris Coyne, I humbly admit myself. In general, this notion of coordination problems, how we recognize that people resolve things like conflict resolution in their own communities, and understand the context of their community that contribute to the institutional norms that develop therein. Jersey Shore has its own culture, its own identity, and its own social norms. And lastly is a tradition which I would call the sort of Block and McCloskey tradition of economics. Walter Block, a friend and colleague of mine, wrote an infamous text called Defending the Undefendable, and the subtitle is like The Pimp, the Slumlord, the Prostitute, where he takes some of the most taboo behaviors in human society and argues that at their base they are A, voluntary, and B, mutually beneficial amongst the people who participate in them. And so in contrast, he often brings up the notion of regulators or police enforcement compare and contrast that voluntary behaviors win-win in contrast to regulatory, political, and coercive behaviors win-lose, at least on their own terms, enhance the welfare of those who practice them. And secondly, Deirdre McCloskey's latest research project, beginning with bourgeois virtue, is twofold. A, she's defending the undefendable. I often say McCloskey's latest bourgeois virtues is sort of the thinking man's defending the undefendable, whereas Bloch is very crude and a nose twister. McCloskey is much more subtle and a wordsmith. But her whole project is to sort of defend the notion that capitalism is virtue enhancing and morally vibrant. And secondly, she has a more subtle methodological implication that rather than, say, being obsessed with the formalistic techniques of modern neoclassical economics, that we should take more seriously forms of source materials, narrative, and culture. And the reason for this, in large part, is because things like framing effects that people ascribe to their behaviors give us the context with which we can recognize and understand the means and end structures of rational behavior. Oftentimes we watch people do things that look ridiculous or offensive or irrational and crazy. And yet, if we had a more intimate understanding of the identities with which the people who are performing them subscribe to, or the cultural practices that they believe in, or the faiths that they hold internally, we would have a better understanding of how their behaviors are not so seamlessly irrational, but in fact subscribe to the basic framework of maximizing benefits, minimizing costs. And so, with that in mind, I hope to suggest that we should be paying attention to the forms of culture that exist in our society, things like reality television and Jersey Shore, one of them. So, without further ado, in what ways do the characters of the Jersey Shore conform to certain economic rationales? First and foremost, we have the situation's first law of demand, which I have printed on my door of my office and have used as a teaching tool myself in order to inspire my students to understand diminishing marginal value. In other words, the Jersey Shore is a really great comparative example because everybody thinks they're idiots. So if they can understand a concept themselves, it inspires my students not to want to be any less informed than they. So, situation on the first law of demand. A common mistake guys make is treating any girl like gold. It's the law of diminishing returns, bro. If you always treat a girl like a princess, she's going to get bored. Here we see the obvious notion of diminishing marginal value. On the first date, it yields lots of utility. Second and third and fourth, on and on, downwards, so to speak. Each unit of interaction should yield less utility for the consumer. Since, sort of using this example, none of my students have gotten the diminishing law of returns incorrect on a final exam. So I'm pleased with that. Situation on compensating differentials. This one's even more crude than the first. Another misconception is that the better sex is always to be had with the hotter chick. But it can be argued that indeed the best sex is often with the grenade because she's so grateful. For those not in the know, a grenade, as we'll come to discuss in the context of internal and private language communities, refers to an overweight, uglier woman, whereas landmines are uglier, thinner. The situation on human capital. In a discussion of what's referred to as wingmandom, wingmen are aides and brethren in the search for hooking up with hot chicks. The situation describes the characteristic features of his ideal wingman. Namely, your ideal wingman can hold the line when it comes to meeting and leaving the club with women. You want a wingman who's a good-looking guy who will attract beautiful women because it increases the odds of you both hooking up with hot chicks. This is in contrast to the perception that each wingman would be perceived as a substitute from the mind's eye perspective of the women that they're trying to court. Seems like an inaccurate word, but so he's arguing that wingmen and yourself should be perceived as complements rather than substitutes. That together they can sort of reach higher levels of utility. Situation on entrepreneurship. This is still on the topic of being a wingman. It's a game of strategy and numbers. You're